Card reveal season continues in Legends of Runeterra. The team dropped a new video on their YouTube channel revealing the next champion from the final Call of the Mountain expansion, which will be called Cosmic Creation, set to release on December 16th. The new champion is ZOE, and in typical Runeterra fashion, some other new cards were shown along with ZOE, and they're all Targon cards. In this video, we'll be talking about ZOE and all the other cards, and as usual, I'll be giving some additional thoughts on what types of decks these cards could end up in. Before we jump in, if you've been enjoying the content so far and want to see more, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little surprised that ZOE was revealed next because I thought the Legends of Runeterra team would save the Targon champion for last, like they did with the Monuments of Power spoilers. I'm not surprised at all, however, that the Targon champion is in fact ZOE. So let's start off by talking about ZOE. ZOE is a 1 mana, 1/1 elusive that reads Nexus Strike, create a Supercool Starchart in hand, or if you have one, reduce its cost by 1. Level up, I've seen you play 10 cards with different names. ZOE's level 2 is a 2/2 elusive that reads for the rest of the game, when you summon an ally, grant its keywords to all allies. Nexus Strike, create a Behold the Infinite that costs 0 in hand. So the first thing that came to mind is that ZOE is very similar to Fizz and Teemo in that ZOE costs 1 mana, has low stats, and has elusive. Granted, ZOE plays a bit more like Teemo than Fizz. I do think ZOE is better than Teemo in the sense that you don't necessarily need to level her up to get good value out of her. In some ways, she's kind of a juiced up spacey sketcher, except ZOE is actually an engine that can keep giving you cheaper invoke cards as long as you have the mana to spend to grab them, and as long as you can keep hitting the Nexus with her. I do think Supercool Starchart is a solid card, something we'll get into later. Aside from that, if you're only relying on Targon cards, I think ZOE will be extremely difficult to level up, even if you play all the cards shown here today in your deck. Also, keep in mind she has to be in play and actually see you play those cards, so she won't passively level up while she's in your deck. I think the best chance for ZOE to level up would be to pair her with another region that can create cards. The only other region that does that very well is Piltover and Zaun. So it's possible Victor may actually be a good pairing for ZOE. Even though neither champion has huge stats that will absolutely take over a board, sometimes you don't need that. Twisted Fate, for example, is a great support type of champion, but he can and will take over a game on his own, despite having a smaller stat line than most other champs. Some are probably thinking to pair ZOE with Submersible or even Pursuit of Perfection, but I don't think you necessarily need to. Invoke, when combined with Piltover and Zaun cards that create other cards, like Victor and some of his support cards, might be enough. Overall, the deck ZOE is in would need to be okay with not leveling her up and having other ways to win. I think she'll be exciting to build with though. I want to preface something before we look at the rest of the cards shown here. These cards are all designed to work well with ZOE, there's no denying that. In fact, I'd say that you're likely going to play most of these if you're building a deck with ZOE, and you intend to level ZOE up. So for the rest of the cards, I want to focus on actually evaluating them based on how good they are on their own, because I think that's just as important as how well they work with ZOE, which they clearly do. Let's actually start off with ZOE's champion spell, Sleepy Trouble Bubble. So Sleepy Trouble Bubble is a 2-mana soul spell that stuns an enemy and creates a fleeting paddle star in hand. This is basically a Guile that costs 1 more, but makes a fleeting card that can potentially remove a threat entirely if you have 5 mana available. I don't think this is actually strong enough to run on its own, and it's better treated as a spell you sometimes have access to if you're playing ZOE. 5 mana seems like a bit much to get rid of a medium-sized threat. There are ways to spend more than 5 mana to remove threats, but it's not just the mana cost. It's the fact that you have to take up 2 actions to do so, and both actions can be either countered outright by Deny, Nopify, or Bastion, or disrupted by some other spell like Single Combat or even Noxian Fervor. Arachnoid Sentry into Ravenous Flock, while they can both also be interrupted, cost less mana, and you get a 3/2 body on board. I could be wrong about this card, but I doubt it. I wouldn't be surprised if this saw no play. There's just too many things that can go wrong. So let's talk about Paddlestar next. Paddlestar is a 3-mana slow spell that reads deal 4 to an enemy that attacked this round or is stunned. I think this card on its own has a very high ceiling, but also a very low floor, meaning that this card can be extremely good or it can be quite bad and might even sit dead in your hand at times. And that's simply because one of the requirements to use this card relies completely on what your opponent does, which usually isn't a good thing. Because of that, if you want this card to be as consistent as possible, I think you'll need to pair it with decks that have stun effects. Targon itself is capable of doing that. Aside from the sleepy Trouble Bubble spell that this card generates from and combos with, Targon has Leona and the Daybreak package, and you sometimes can even invoke a Crescent Strike from certain cards. Outside of that, Noxus and Ionia have stun effects in spades, so those are options. All that being said, if you do run this in your ZOE deck and you're pairing her with Piltover and Zaun, like I mentioned earlier, you'll have to be okay with this being a dead card in your hand sometimes, since Piltover and Zaun has no stun effects. I don't think this card by itself is that bad overall. It's just limited to specific decks if you want to get the absolute most out of it. Next, let's talk about Spell Thief. Spell Thief is a 1-mana burst spell that reads pick one of 3 enemy spells played this game and create a copy in hand. This is probably one of the most interesting and potentially one of the most powerful cards shown with ZOE. This will be extremely powerful against unit heavy decks like Scouts that rely on board position to win games because they run very few spells, and the spells they do play impact the board in a big way. However, I also think this will get less powerful as the game goes on, since the longer the game goes, the more spells that your opponent will play, and the harder it will be to target a specific spell that your opponent played earlier. This card falls off even faster against spell-heavy decks like Ezreal and Heimerdinger. Regardless, I do think this could have a place in several decks, not just the ones that play ZOE. Next, let's jump over to Supercool Starchart. This is a 2-mana burst spell that reads invoke a celestial card that costs 3 or less. Even this card, without being created by ZOE, feels like a slightly better version of Spacey Sketcher, which is in the same Call of the Mountain set, and we've only had Sketcher in the game for a few months now. Sure, you get a 1/1 for playing Sketcher, but I think I'd rather trade a 1/1 body for not being forced to discard a card anymore in order to invoke from the exact same set of cards. This isn't strictly worse than Behold the Infinite either, because while Behold gives you access to the entire Celestial card pool, when you use invoke cards that don't target Celestials of a specific cost, the odds are heavily weighted towards the cheaper Celestials. So the chances of you getting a more expensive finisher like the Great Beyond are lower. Also, there's just less RNG when it comes to the targeted invoke cards like this and Solari Priestess. You generally know what your options are going to be from that smaller pool of cards, so you can plan accordingly. This is a solid card that I think will be the new Spacey Sketcher, a tech choice for some of the decks that run Sketcher sometimes. Next we have Starry Scamp. This is a 2-mana 2/2 unit that reads I cost 2 less if you behold a Celestial. This card is fine. It's another card that works very well in very specific decks. As I said earlier, this card, like all the other cards shown, is designed to work well with ZOE. So the question is, does Starry Scamp work in other decks focused around Invoke? I think it can. As an anti-aggro tool, you can play for 0 mana. The Aurelion Soul decks that don't use Leona and the Daybreak package might want this. It really comes down to the 0 mana cost. What I mean is that this isn't a bad card at all, but I think the 0 mana cost has to go a pretty long way to justify running this over other early game options in Targon like Solari Shieldbearer or even Mountain Goat. And finally we have Sparklefly. This is a 2-mana 1/2 with Elusive and Lifesteal. This reminds me of Fledgling Stellacorn, the 3-mana 1/2 with Spell Shield and Lifesteal that we got 2 months ago with Soraka. I think this card is just straight up better than Stellacorn is, but by definition this isn't power creep since they have slightly different keywords and different mana costs. This is the only card in this group that I can't really see being played outside of ZOE decks, unfortunately. Then again, there is a very small possibility that Victor decks that play the Mechanized Mimic that was spoiled earlier would want this, since Mechanized Mimic can get Sparklefly's keywords. Or you could also play this with Give It All, the Piltover KDA promo spell. In all those scenarios though, you'd need to keep this alive, which might be hard given the low stats and lack of inherent protection from something like Spell Shield, Tough, or Barrier. That's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this look into ZOE and the other cards that were revealed. If you did, feel free to leave a like, as it gets this video out there to others in the community. If you don't want to miss future coverage of the new set from me, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the notification bell below to make sure you know when the next video goes live. Feel free to check out the other Legends of Runeterra videos that I have on the channel, or even the other places you can find me on the internet. You'll find links to my Twitter, Twitch channel, and our community Discord that you can join as well in the video description below. Thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.